The seller of this ASUS STRIX GTX 980 claimed that the video card was defective. I didn't find anything wrong with it, so I took the opportunity to see how this old Maxwell card handles gaming in 2026. This is also the first 80s class featured here, so we'll get to experience firsthand how an old flagship GPU managed to hold its value. Judging by how it behaves in Arc Raiders, one could say that it still does a pretty good job, but we'll see later on how consistent that conclusion is. I won't dwell too much on the features of the card, the GPU-Z window should have all that covered. I will point out the 4GB of video memory connected to the GPU through a 256-bit bus. And unlike the 970, there are no tricks this time around. The card has an official TDP of 165 watts, but some games, like Overwatch 2, will push it a little bit over 190 watts. ASUS opted for a pretty hefty cooling solution, using 4 heat pipes to carry away the heat to a sizable fin stack. 2 fairly large fans strapped on top of the entire thing complete the rather heavy thermal solution. One of the beefs that I have with this setup is that it does not take care of cooling the video memory. I'll rant more on the cooling in the conclusions. For now, I'll only mention that the card stays at 75 degrees in load for a delta over ambient of 52. The video card was tested in the same PC, running a Ryzen 5 5600 and 32GB of DDR4 in dual channel at 3600 MHz. We start with Marvel Rivals at low settings. 1080 resolution has the GTX 980 averaging 61 FPS with 1% lows at 51. This is close enough to call it playable, but if more FPS is needed, you can drop the resolution to 1280 by 720. You'll be rewarded with 104 FPS on average and consistent 1% lows of 86 FPS. In Cyberpunk 2077, the card managed to get the 1% lows above 30 FPS for a number of configurations. But if you want to increase the quality settings, you have to pay the price, a reduced pixel count. 1080 low settings, or 1600 by 900 at medium settings, or even 1280 by 720 high settings, all will perform the same with an average in the high 40s and 1% lows in the mid 30s. Despite being an online shooter, I found Arc Raiders to be playable, at least in friendly lobbies, with just 30 FPS for the 1% lows. The GTX 990 will provide an average FPS between 72 FPS at 1080 resolution and 97 FPS at 720 resolution. The 1% lows range in the same conditions between 49 and 58 FPS, definitely playable. Fortnite is easier to run, so in order to avoid a CPU bottleneck, I decided to test using the DirectX 12 renderer and medium settings. The Maxwell card averaged between 108 FPS at 1080 resolution and 163 FPS at 720. The 1% lows were very consistent, ranging from 81 FPS at 1080 to 117 at the lowest tested resolution. I'd still play the game in performance mode though, and set an FPS cap. This way you get both better visibility of your opponents and a smooth frame rate. Control is a game that launched 5 years after the GTX 980 was released. To get a passing grade, the Nvidia card must deliver at least 30 FPS for the 1% lows in this game. And as you can see from the numbers on screen, the card manages to do that at 1080 resolution and high settings. The average FPS landed in the mid 40s while the 1% low settled in the high 30s. I tested Rainbow Six Siege only at 1080 resolution, but at a few quality settings this time around. The results I got had me scratching my head, so here they are. 114 FPS on average and 78 FPS for the 1% lows, for both high and low settings. Now you can scratch your head as well. But despite what I think it is a bug in the game, the card will play this title just fine. Apex Legends was tested at low settings, and while the system did not get into a CPU bottleneck, the frame rate did reach the internal 300 FPS cap at the lower resolution tested. So, depending on the video resolution selected, the GTX 980 can deliver between 179 FPS and 255 FPS on average. The 1% lows are well above 60 FPS, ranging from 131 at 1080 resolution and 176 at 1280 by 720. Far Cry 6, however, enjoys an easier to reach performance target of 30 FPS for the 1% lows. The GTX 980 manages to clear it at 1080 Ultra settings. The average FPS stayed in the high 40s, while the 1% lows managed 40 FPS flush. I went against my better judgment and tested Overwatch 2 at low settings, and at the lowest resolution, the card managed to hit the internal 600 FPS cap. This ended up affecting the numbers collected, but again, just for one resolution. So, the low settings will have the GTX 980 averaging between 333 FPS and 589, depending on the resolution. The 1% lows range between 242 and 460. A note about this game, it managed to trick the GTX 980 into pulling over 190 watts of power. I disabled FSR when testing Resident Evil 4 since I wanted to check how the GTX 980 handles the game at full scale. As expected, the Prioritize Performance preset produced better results with an average FPS of 66 and the 1% was managing low 50s. But you can safely go to the Balanced preset, again with FSR disabled. Sure, the average FPS will decrease to 51, but the 1% lows will still manage above 30. Counter-Strike 2 is all about the highest FPS possible, so naturally one would test at low settings. But I wanted to limit the impact of a potential CPU limit, so I went for 1080 resolution, medium settings and 2x MSAA. Still, the GTX 980 managed 245 FPS on average and 115 FPS 41% lows, which is more than enough for me. The performance target that the GTX 980 has to meet in Borderlands 3 is 30 FPS 41% lows. This is doable at 1080 resolution and badass settings. The card averages 43 FPS and gets 35 41% lows. If more FPS is needed, you can drop the settings to high to get 13 more FPS for the average and 9 more for the 1% lows. DOTA 2 is notoriously CPU bound, so I decided to test it at 1080 resolution and highest settings. Yet the power draw of the GPU did not get close to 190 watts. So, 124 FPS for the average and 63 FPS for the 1% lows. The 30 FPS for the 1% lows proved a bit difficult for the GTX 980 in Robocop. Granted though, the test was done at 1080 resolution, but it still took dropping the quality to low. The card then averaged 35 FPS and got 29 FPS for the 1% lows. For more FPS you need to drop the resolution, but I don't think it's needed, considering that Murphy won't do any 360 no-scope anytime soon. The Finals is an online shooter though, so the card needs to pull 60 FPS for the 1% lows. At 1080 resolution and low settings, the Maxwell card is capable of 85 FPS on average and 65 FPS for the 1% lows. The game plays fine. Swinging back to single-player titles, Shadow of the Tomb Raider runs fine at 1080 resolution and highest settings. The GTX 980 manages 61 FPS on average and 44 FPS for the 1% lows. This is perfectly fine for a single-player stealth game. We end the gaming session with Terminator, and since the game is fairly old and the GPU is quite capable, I decided to test it at 1080 resolution and epic settings. The average FPS stayed in the mid-90s, which is quite appropriate for the game. The 1% lows managed low 50s, which is also more than enough. I really like Maxwell. I think that it is the best GPU architecture that was built on the 28nm lithography process. To drive that point further, the GTX 980 manages about the same performance for similar power consumption as the newer RX 580, and the AMD card is built on a process that is half that size. But I am not a fan of what ASUS did with the chip. Again, both the RX 580 and the GTX 980 have TDPs in the same ballpark and they offer similar performance. ASUS, however, insists on a cooling system that puts the video card a smidge above 1 kg. Gigabyte, however, seems to be happy with a card that is only 600 grams, a bit over half of the STRIX. The heavier cooling system will induce higher mechanical stress in the solder joints between the various chips and the PCB, like the GPU and video memory, increasing the likelihood of defects. And to add insult to injury, unlike Gigabyte's lighter cooler that it is designed to make contact and cool off the video memory chips as well, ASUS decided to skip on that. It's like ASUS went all in for looks and zero fucks given to the lifespan of the device. If it breaks, you'll then have to either upgrade or buy another one. And speaking of, the price for used ones ranges between $60 and $100. This is about the same as a GTX 1070 or 1660, with the disadvantage of a higher TDP. If you already have one, use it. But if you plan to buy a used GPU in this performance bracket, I would recommend the newer Pascal or Turing cards. But that's not because the Maxwell architecture is bad. As I said, the 900 is one of my favorite GeForce series. But lower TDP cards will typically last longer, since they don't heat up that much and they don't need such a heavy cooler. But we'll see more about that in a future video. As for this one, we're done. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked it, and I'll see you for